Welcome back everyone to another video on the Vixen Victory channel. Today we're going to be talking about Lyney and a build guide about him, some other things that he can work on, how he's going to work as a character, look at obviously the teams. Obviously I'm going to be using him in the trial, so let's go ahead and take a look at his different talents, looking at leveling priority for him as a character. Now the thing to remember with Lyney is yes, he is a pyro DPS, but the biggest thing about him, as we're going to see with his different things and his talents as well, is that we're going to see that he is focused on wanting a lot of pyro characters. Even in his trial, he does have, characters like Ling and Bennett. So although usually your pyro characters focus into melt or vaporize or something like that, usually he's usually one of those characters that starts to stay away from that. And if he can, that's great. But usually he wants two other pyro characters in his party. And even you can see here they go for more of an overload setup here as well, just to get that other healer in there as well from Kuki. Now let's go ahead and talk about his leveling priority. Now, like normal, because of, just being in the trial state, all the characters are fully leveled into what they're doing anyways. Although usually I always say that, the normal attack talent isn't something that you usually want to level when you're in the trial, even if you see it at level 8. Depending on the character, usually it's not necessary, or one of them is not necessary. Here, actually, all three of his talents are extremely necessary for him. The major way that you are going to be doing pretty much some of your damage is through your normal attack talent and through your skill, and then the burst is a really big damage hit as well. So overall, keeping all of your, your normal attack talent, your skill, and your burst talent all at the same level is probably a good idea, so leveling them together, but they all need to be at a higher level than the other. I would obviously look to get this at level 8 at the lowest, especially if you can get the character to level 90 and you are at the end of the game, then that is what you're going to want to do. But keeping these levels same as you are increasing them together is going to be the best thing for you, so you can see pretty good damage across the board with all of his talents. Well, looking a little bit further, let's go ahead and talk about the talent info. We'll look past the normal attack and the plunging attack in the talent here. Let's go ahead and talk about his charge attack. He will perform a more precise aim shot that will have an increased amount of damage. Now, there are two different levels that you get from this. The charge level 1 fires off a pyro infused arrow dealing pyro damage. This is not the way that you're normally going to use him. What you're going to want to do is the charge level 2. The charge level 2 fires off a prop arrow that deals pyro damage, and upon hit, it will summon a Grin Malkin hat. When firing the prop arrow, and when Lyney has more than 60% HP, he will consume a portion of his HP to obtain one prop surplus stack, with a max of 5 stacks. And the effect will be removed after the character spends 30 seconds out of combat, and the lowest Lyney can drop to this method, basically with his HP, is 60% of his max HP. Because he is a Fontaine character, you usually start to see some of the characters have that, HP change in their kit, and obviously you can see that here with Lyney. Now the great thing about this is that each time that you're going to do that charge attack, it is 20% of your HP cost. So having a healer in there to, make sure that your HP stays high is good for multiple reasons, right? Because you can't drop your HP any lower than 60%. But if you start at 100% and do 2 of these charge attacks and get the prop arrows out, you're going to immediately you're only going to be able to get 2 of these stacks, and that can be a little bit annoying with him. So as you get a healer, you can start putting up more of those Grin Malkin hats, and then at the same time you can get more prop surplus stacks. Once you do that though, obviously you're getting healed more, you can go back higher than your 60% HP and then keep going and using those charge attacks. Now, looking at the Grin Malkin hat that he throws out, it can taunt a nearby opponent and attract their attacks, and each opponent can only be taunted by the hat one time every 5 seconds. So it is nice to know that it at least takes a lot of the focus off of Lyney. Usually with him as a character, he's not someone that is like Ganyu or something like that, where they're in their charge attack state for so long that they are pretty vulnerable most of the time. It is very nice because he does have a lot in his kit that can help him kind of keep away, and we'll look at the other parts of his kit as well that can allow him to do that. So having something that just has a little bit of taunting can help just a little bit, but it's not necessarily something insane that you need for him, but it is something because he is a charge attack bow character that is going to be at least helpful. The hat will inherit a percentage of Lyney's max HP, so it can be destroyed, and if it is destroyed, or if the duration that it has expires, it will fire off a pyrotechnic strike at one nearby opponent, dealing pyro damage. If you have here the prop arrow that you originally do through this, you're going to fire off a prop arrow on only the second charge level. You're going to hit an enemy, and that is going to do 276.5% attack based on everything else that he does. Obviously, a little bit later, you can see the duration of the Green Malkin Hat is 4 seconds. So, throwing out a Green Malkin Hat, as soon as it expires, it will explode. Or if it gets attacked and it blows up, then it will also explode. So then you will fire off that Pyrotechnic Strike. That Pyrotechnic Strike is 339.2% of his attack. And this is all at level 8, so these stats can get higher. And then obviously you have the normal, the Arlecchino that he can do, which will have an extra Numa aligned hit that will happen as well. That is just going to do some extra little bit of attack as well. And then you have a Thorn interval that you can have, which is going to happen it allows you to use it every 6 seconds. So very, very nice to know. With his, normal attack, with that charge attack, you're seeing a lot of the damage come, but also it's from that Green Malkin Hat that he uses. So although I'm not in combat here, that's charge level 1, and then you saw instantaneously that charge level 2 came out of nowhere. And if you saw immediately and there you go, the little explosion, but as you saw, you can also see on the left side of him, you can see how many Green Malkin stacks that you have. Charge level 2, and as soon as he goes out, I can do that. And then as soon as I create another one, now here's the thing, if you create 2, the other one immediately explodes. But if you notice when I did that, I'm only still at 2. You already see that he's at 60% of his HP. So only when Lyney can get to a higher amount of HP and then delete his HP can he start actually getting those prop surplus stacks. So now that you see that I'm at a higher amount of HP, that's why I could only sit at 2. It was because I couldn't delete any more of my HP to be at basically a higher HP to actually delete my HP from. So that's the idea with Lyney, and that's why you can't just sit there and only focus on him. You actually have to focus look at his HP and make sure you're not low on HP, not because you're afraid of him dying, which that's also something to keep in mind, but having an extremely solid healer on the team is going to make sure that he stays at the point where he can get those prop surplus stacks and do more damage. Now let's go ahead and look at his skill. Looking a little bit further, it states in the talent info of his skill, Lyney does a flourish with his hat, unleashing a firework surprise. When used, he will clear all current prop surplus stacks and deal AoE pyro damage up to opponents that are in front of him. Damage will be increased according to the stacks that are cleared, and this will also regenerate Lyney's HP based on his max HP. So that's what I was talking about. When you have more of those prop surplus stacks, it doesn't necessarily help your skill or your normal attack, your charge attack damage of the Green Malkin Hat, but it does help increase the damage that you're going to use in your skill next. Also, when a Green Malkin Hat created by Lyney is on the field at this point in time, the fireworks will also cause it to explode when you use the skill, dealing AoE pyro damage equal to that of the Pyrotechnic Strike. So, if you do have the ability to blow it up, it will do basically the same amount of damage that you do in the Pyrotechnic Strike. If you use the skill, it will blow up the little Green Malkin Hat that's on the field, and you can do even more damage. The damage dealt through the Green Malkin Hat in this way is considered charge attack damage. So, if we look a little bit further in his burst though, it states that unleashing his magic, Lyney turns himself into a Green Malkin Hat that can move around very quickly. Not to be mistaken for the Green Malkin Hat. So it's Green Malkin Cat, not Hat. They're two different props. When the Green Malkin Cat gets close to opponents, it will send flames falling down on them, dealing at most 1 instance of pyro damage to each opponent. When the duration ends, he will dismiss the Green Malkin Cat and ignite fireworks that deal AoE pyro damage, summon 1 Green Malkin Hat, and grant himself 1 prop surplus stack. Usually at this point in time, you want to make sure that you're probably trying to maybe start out the rotation with his burst, but it also does mean just because that you can get yourself a Green Malkin Hat as well as a prop surplus stack, that is technically what you might want to try to do, but at the same time, if you don't have it, you can technically use it at the end of a rotation, but I wouldn't really necessarily try to do that. Some people even use it in the middle to just get some damage out, get some prop surplus stacks, and then use the burst and the tech kind of just get some extra damage while you're kind of going out on field, get another prop surplus stack to maybe get you to 4 or 5, and then just try to get higher, and then use your skill to use up all of your prop surplus stacks and get higher damage. In my personal opinion, I'm not sure that you really want to use the burst at the end when you're trying to get higher prop surplus stacks. Now let's go a little bit further. Basically, while you're in this mode though, basically he's going to be running around as a cat in a hat, literally, and he's just going to be like running around. You will be able to tag onto enemies as well and put pyro on them, but usually you're just trying to immediately just explode on them and do a big damage hit, just like it shows in here. So that is kind of the idea, and then afterwards you want to probably try to use your skill so that you can get a higher damage hit through the skill as well. Now let's look a little bit further and talk about his first passive talent. If Lyney consumes HP when firing off a prop arrow, the Grin Malkin hat summoned by the arrow will, upon hitting an opponent, restore 3 energy to Lyney and increase damage dealt by 80% of his attack. So as you saw earlier, I was kind of just shooting the ground, and while characters like, technically, like characters like Ganyu that I was talking about earlier, technically can make it work into kind of the idea with the character to just hit the ground. Usually with Lyney, you're actually going to want to hit an enemy. So that's just basically to make sure that you are getting more energy, which we saw that using his burst is actually pretty prevalent and useful. So getting the extra energy is good, as well as the increase to his damage dealt by 80% of his attack is also very helpful as well. Looking at the second passive talent, it states that the damage Lyney deals to opponents affected by pyro will receive the following buffs. Basically, once again, this is just another reason to have more pyro characters. So let's look at it. Increases the damage dealt by 60%. So Lyney now does 60% more damage to enemies that have pyro on them. Each pyro party member other than Lyney will cause the damage dealt to increase that he does by an additional 20%. And the maximum you can get is 100%. So if you're at 60% and you have one extra character, that's 80%, 2 extra pyro characters other than Lyney, and that's 100%. Now you're starting to see where the extra damage that he does, you're practically doubling your damage when you have 2 other pyro characters on the field. So once again, or in the party, which means once again, the reason why you even see here, why you have 2 other pyro characters, and why most of the time you're always going to see that with Lyney, is basically because of that second passive talent. Now, you can work outside of it. It's not necessarily to say that you can't, but it does do wonders, in my personal opinion, to actually do that, and I'm pretty sure most people would agree with me there. Now, technically, you can run some sort of vaporized team and take out the last character. You can throw in a character like Shilonen in here. You can throw in a character like Farina, because Farina helps a lot with the HP change. Just make sure you have some pretty good healers. You could use another character, like a different character like Kazuha, or an Animo character that's using Viridescent. There are plenty of other characters that you can use in this 4 slot, even Zhongli as well. He gets Shred on resistances. He's also a great shielder as well. So there's plenty of things that you can do to put in that 4th slot. Just keep in mind you're going to want to make sure that the other 2 characters are pyro. And now looking at characters like Maoika in the future that could have some good off-field pyro application, this might actually be someone, or maybe not off-field application, but damage. It looks like someone like Xiangling can finally be benched, but sadly it looks like Circle Impact is going to keep going, and we are going to have Bennett most likely through every one of these teams. Technically, you could switch this off with someone like Chevreuse, and then after having Chevreuse here, you can throw in a character like Kuki, Fischl, Yaimiko, an Electro character like that. That'll allow you to do some pretty big overload damage and just help Lyney. Because once again, the whole point of overload with Chevreuse is just to have Pyro and Electro characters in the team. And with Lyney wanting 3 Pyro characters, including himself, it already works out. So just throwing an Electro character in there can make it pretty useful. But more on that when we actually look at teams. So let's go ahead and talk about specific weapons. Obviously, his personal weapon is going to be his best weapon. But since I already have the weapon, let's go ahead and actually leave the domain and leave the event that I already have running. And let's actually go talk about the actual kind of weapons that we have here to look at his weapons. Now, sadly, because I was going after Arlecchino, I have his bow, which is a little rough because not only do I have one of his bows, I actually have 2. Which, once again, sad, but it is what it is. Either way, at level 90, you're going to get 66.2% crit damage of the first great magic. An extremely solid bow here. I'm not going to really go into it just because it is a very, very good bow for him. And if you have this bow as an extra, you should probably be trying to pull him, unlike me who's skipping. So keep that in mind as you are running for him. If you really like Lyney, he has a little bit of an interesting style as we just went over with his character kit, but he is probably one of the most prolific and highest damage dealers in the game just because of a lot of theoretical damage that he can do. Lyney is still a very solid character, and that's actually, in my personal opinion, why they kind of had to quote-unquote nerf him by only going to Pyro as a character, because they wanted someone to just go full-blown into an element besides just something like Geo, and actually just, it's only that one element and it's not reaction based, but it does so much damage, it's worth it. So that's where I think Lyney stands. He does have a little bit of a difficult kit, and it can be a little annoying to kind of learn his rotations, but once you do, he's an extremely fun and extremely good character as well. But obviously, his personal bow is going to be his best weapon, especially if you're like me and accidentally got multiple copies of it. Because he goes into crit rate, usually getting a crit damage bow is going to be the desired outcome, especially because with his artifact set that we're going to talk about in a second, Marechaussee Hunter, that 4-piece is giving a lot of crit rate as well. So getting another crit rate kind of bow, I would say, is a little bit something that you're going to want to stay away from. So something like Aqua Simulacra with a high amount of kind of, once again, crit damage, having such a high amount there, that's really just a stat stick here. And also the ability technically does increase damage a little bit as well, so that is very helpful. Another weapon we could look at besides Aqua Simulacra is something like Thundering Pulse, has the same amount of crit damage. The ability is like kind of half useful, and the reason I say half useful is just because the attack is increased by 20%, but the other kind of just helps with normal attack damage, and he doesn't really focus on that, obviously, he's more focusing into charge attacks. Now, I did talk about how other 5-star weapons are going to be good, but you kind of want to focus and do crit damage, but technically things like Skyward Harp or even Amos's bow, crit rate and an attack percent bow are going to be pretty good. In my personal opinion, I would actually rather have something like Amos's bow over something like, once again, Skyward Harp, just because of the main stat difference. And the ability obviously does increase crit damage on Skyward Harp, but Amos's bow increases charge attack damage, and then as you are, as the arrow flies farther, you are dealing more damage. So technically, Amos's bow, I do think, has a pretty solid run, especially with all the crit rate that you get from his Ascension, as well from the artifact set. You can just full blow go into all crit damage when you look at his pieces and his artifacts. So that's kind of the idea with 5 stars. 4 stars, on the other hand, something like the Song of Stillness is going to be a pretty solid weapon. This is an attack percent bow, and this states that after the wielder is healed, they will deal an additional 16% more damage for 8 seconds. And this can be triggered even when the character is not on the field. So if you are switching off Lyney and you are healing him with like a party-wide healer, this also does help as well, someone like a different character that you might be using. So that is something that I do want to state that can be pretty good. Something like Song of Stillness is a very good weapon, and probably, in my personal opinion, one of his better 4-star weapons, just because of how strong it can be. You're constantly healing Lyney to make sure that he can actually get those prop surplus stacks. Once again, you're always trying to make sure that he's staying above 60% HP. Obviously a little bit different than some of the other characters that are in the game, like someone like Hu Tao that you're trying to keep below the 50% threshold. Looking at another weapon that you could use, something like Prototype Crescent, which is an attack percent bow as well. Starting to see a theme here, hopefully. This does state that charge attack hits on weak opponents will increase movement speed by 10% and attack by 36%. This is just at R1. Obviously at R5 you're increasing your attack by an insane amount, and this is a craftable weapon, so it is pretty good as well. And I do just want to state that yes, movement speed is helpful, because if you go to his weapon, it increases attack and movement speed. So something like Prototype Crescent, a 4-star craftable weapon from the early parts of the game, is basically the 4-star version of a 5-star weapon we saw in something 4 years later. So it's a very, very good weapon, I do want to say, for Lyney, so don't sleep on that weapon either. Now, once again, just like I did with the 5 stars, I'm going to do with the 4 stars. Even though I did state to stay away from crit rate bows, something like Scion of the Blazing Sun is a battle pass weapon, is going to be pretty good. The charge attacks, obviously, as you're going to be doing it, you'll have a Sunfire Arrow that will descend and hit an opponent, do a little bit of damage. But the major idea here is that you're hitting them with the Heat Seer effect. At that point in time, for 10 seconds, opponents affected by the Heat Seer take 28% more charge attack damage. This is just at R1, it gets even better. So you have a pretty good bow in Scion of the Blazing Sun, helping a lot of extra damage being done here. It does have a lower crit rate than some of the other weapons, especially Battle Pass weapons that are usually around almost 30%, around 27.6%. But you're getting a huge buff here, and if you can get multiple copies of these weapons, your Lyney is going to be very, very thankful for it. Once again, just focusing on crit damage mainly in your stats. And then obviously something like Blackcliff Longbow, the crit damage main stat 4-star weapon, a pretty good amount of crit damage. After you defeat an opponent, it'll help increase attack a little bit more for 30 seconds, and you have multiple stacks of this. So this weapon's a little bit more for obviously the main stat, but also for wave clearing of enemies. If there's a lot of small enemies in the Abyss, or something like Imaginarium Theater, Lyney can do pretty well with this bow as well. Now let's look a little bit further. I've talked a lot about artifacts while talking about these specific weapons. So let's go ahead and look at artifacts. Now I'm going to go to I'll just stay on this character basically for now anyways. But either way, usually the artifact set that you're going to want to run with specifically Lyney is going to be something like Marechaussee. Now I'm going to jump over to a different character when we are looking at this set, just so that we can see a little bit more of similar stats of which you're going to want to look for on the character. So looking at this, we're going to be looking at the 4-piece of Maréchal, just because of my artifact set recommendations for specifically Risley are similar to what you're going to want to put on your Lyney. Now, with him as a character, with Lyney, you are focusing on trying to make sure that you're having a pretty good crit, as we talked about, but also crit damage. And that is going to help a lot in the Maréchal Hunter set. Now, the 2-piece states that it increases normal charge attack damage by 15%. Obviously, Lyney is focusing on charge attack damage, so the 2-piece is still helpful. The 4-piece states that when current HP increases or decreases, crit rate will be increased by 12% for 5 seconds with a max of 3 stacks. Now, this is going to happen, yes, when Lyney obviously does the charge attacks and then heals himself, so you're getting probably 2 stacks very quickly. At the same time, you are constantly changing HP by taking damage from other enemies. You're healing yourself by, multiple characters. And if there's small bits of healing, this can also count as increases to HP. So 3 quick heals from this, or maybe 2 quick heals with the actual HP change from his charge stacks. You saw how easy it was to get to charge level 2 after charge level 1. It just is very, very, very quick, which is extremely good for him as a character. Then you're having all of these buffs and everything, so getting the max increase crit rate is very, very easy with him as a character. That does mean that as soon as you get to 5 stacks, you'll probably already have of the prop surplus, you'll already have the 36% crit rate increase, and that means you want to immediately go ahead and use your skill at that point in time to make sure that you are getting that max crit rate, to make sure you are critting whenever you're doing your skill. Using your burst probably at the beginning of the rotation, you can get some pretty good, just like stacks of whatnot and what you do, because as long as you're changing HP, that can help. But honestly, you could also use it at the end, because using it at the end will make sure that you have a higher crit rate for that big damage hit that he does at the end of his burst. Technically, if your characters are still running with their buffs and whatnot, you can go through an entire rotation of getting 5 prop surplus stacks, do your skill, go into your burst, and then have this extra crit rate for your extra damage in your burst, and then start another rotation with Lyney because he'll have the prop surplus stack from the burst. So still pretty helpful in my personal opinion from what I've seen with him as a character. Obviously, Maréchal is going to be his best set to really run for him. Now, I know there's technically other sets that you could run, things that are a little bit different, of some older sets as well. Things that look more or less like Lava Walker, the 4-piece increasing damage with pyro opponents that are affected by pyro. The whole point of his kit is to do more damage to opponents that are affected by pyro. So Lava Walker is probably a very, very, very close second. Things that you could technically use are something like Shimenawa's, a 4-piece. Technically, you can use up a little bit more of your energy. I would try to stay away from Shimenawa's because I do like Lyney's burst. It's not more or less just something you use just to have. It is a pretty big damage hit, so I would try to stay away from that if at all possible. I've even heard and seen people use Vermilion Hereafter, just because once you use your burst, you get an attack increase. And then once again, when the character's HP decreases, their attack will further increase by 10%. This is more of a Zhao specific 4-piece set, and this is because with him, as he goes in his burst, he'll slowly decrease his HP. With Lyney, if you're using the 4-piece Vermilion Hereafter set, you're going to want to use your burst at the beginning of the rotation, and then immediately going into using your charge attacks to lose HP so that you can get the maximum attack from the buff from this set. So that is kind of the idea with Vermilion Hereafter, but I still state that something like Maréchal is going to be the best 4-piece set you can get from him, and the secondary set to that, which is pretty close, is going to be that 4-piece Lava Walker because of the buffs that you can get from it. Now, looking a little bit further at this, we're going to look at, obviously, your main stats. What you're looking for in your sands is attack percent, no kind of change about that. You're looking for a pyro damage bonus main stat here, something that is going to have a lot of crit, and obviously some attack if you can get that as well. But focusing mainly on the higher amount of crit damage is usually what you're going to want to do. And then obviously going into crit rate or crit damage, in my personal opinion, because he ascends into crit rate, because he goes so much into all these different things, going into crit damage is going to be beneficial for you and better for you. So getting a crit damage circle is going to be better. He's getting 36% from his artifact set. He's getting 19% from his ascension. Starting 5, you're already at like 24 plus the 36, so you're immediately already at like 60% crit rate base, never mind what little substats you can get here and there. So I do think that the extra crit rate or the extra crit damage from the main stat is going to be better from the circlet. Now, if you are using one of the other sets that we talked about, going into a crit rate circle is probably going to be more beneficial for you depending on what weapon you used. Also, now let's go ahead and talk about the substats. usually with him as a character, you're going to focus into a lot of crit damage and attack percent. The crit rate is more or less an extra bonus, but the attack percent and crit damage are going to be mainly what you're looking for, and crit rate, where obviously the crit damage circlet is, are going to be more beneficial for you for anything just because of what Lyney is focusing on. Once again, crit damage, because of the 4-piece set, is more beneficial than you could probably gather in most other areas as well. Looking a little bit further, let's go ahead and talk about the constellations that Lyney has. Now, in my personal opinion, I think Lyney does especially fine at C0. He's not an incomplete character without constellations, but like some other characters, the constellations do help. Whereas a character like Hu Tao is almost incomplete without that C1, I think Lyney does fine at C0. But looking at the first constellation, it states that Lyney can have 2 Grin Malkin hats present at one time. Additionally, prop arrows will summon 2 Grin Malkin hats instead of 1, and grant Lyney 1 extra stack of prop surplus. So this effect can occur, by the way, once every 15 seconds, but this allows Lyney to actually have 2 Grin Malkin hats, which means 2 different things that enemies can taunt, keeping the damage and effects off of Lyney so that he can, use the charge attacks more to get more prop surplus stacks. Also, you're doubling the amount of Grin Malkin hats, which means the more damage you do when you use your skill as well, you're blowing up 2 of them instead of 1 at one time. Because those pyrotechnic strikes are now every single time you use that charge attack, you're now summoning 2 Grin Malkin hats, which means obviously with 2 Grin Malkin hats, you're now focusing on having 2 of those out, which means 2 of those pyrotechnic strikes. The C1 is adding a lot of damage already. And then you're basically stacking and getting faster amounts of your prop surplus stacks than you normally would. So it's doubling the speed that you can get those prop surplus stacks, which is also very good. If you think about it, using those 2 charge stacks is obviously just helping you get double already. Now, looking at the C2, when it states that when Lyney is on the field, he will gain a stack of crisp focus every 2 seconds. Each stack will increase his crit damage by 20% with a max of 3 stacks. This effect will be cancelled when Lyney leaves the field. When Lyney's on the field, every 2 seconds, right? So as you're on the field with him as a character, let's go ahead and just try and look at this, right? So if I switch over to my healer, get healing, and then I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 13 seconds to get to 5. Now, if you half that, it's about 6 seconds, maybe 7 seconds, because you'll already have the C1, right? So you're already getting this a lot faster. You're already getting the kind of ability to get the speed a little bit faster, because obviously from that C1, remember, you're getting more prop surplus stacks every time you do that. So whereas I was only getting 1 because the trial version only gives you a C1 Lyney, it's basically the same of what we're doing here. So that means that if I took about 13 seconds to kind of get to the maximum, then that means that half of that, about 7 seconds, gets you the damage, basically to the maximum at C2. Now, if we look at this, every 2 seconds you're on the field, and you have max of 3 stacks. That means 6 seconds on the field, you're going to get an extra 60% crit damage. So very easily already you can see with Lyney being on the field for about 6 or 7 seconds on the field for his damage duration, and that's without even using then his skill next. You have 60% crit damage now, which means after 6 seconds, those first few hits that you're doing in your charge attacks or whatever for the first few seconds, those 5-6 seconds, are not having the full 60, but they are having maybe 20%, maybe 40%, and at the end, now you'll have the time ready for 6%. Now, this effect will be canceled when Lyney leaves the field. This doesn't have a duration anymore, which means that when Lyney gets the maximum of 5 surplus stacks, right, pretend that we have 5 here, then you can immediately then go into using your skill and have 60% crit damage for that. And then at the end of your rotation now, using your burst to then go into your Grin Malkin Cat and hit enemies, deal damage, blah blah blah, and big damage hit. Now with 60% more crit damage. And then you're back to square one, either using skills after you get to prop surplus stacks up. But either way, that's what you're focusing on when using Lyney. So that C2 actually helps out a bunch, but it's because of that C1 also helping out as well. Those kind of work in tandem together. The C3, looking a little bit further, increased the level of the normal attack by 3, and the C5 increased the level of the burst by 3. The C4 states that after an opponent is hit by Lyney's pyro charge attack, this opponent's pyro resistance will be decreased by 20% for 6 seconds. This is not only helping Lyney, but because of the other 2 pyro characters that are in the team usually, you're increasing their damage as well, so that is pretty helpful. Keep that in mind. It's not only a Lyney buff, but it is a team-wide buff usually because of other party members that are in the team. Now looking at the C6, it states that when Lyney fires a prop arrow, he will fire a pyrotechnic strike reprised that will deal 80% of his pyrotechnic strike's damage. This damage is considered charge attack damage. So as soon as when he hits his, this type of prop arrow, you're now dealing a bunch more damage because of that huge pyrotechnic strike that you're doing normally anyways. So if we go back here to the pyrotechnic strike, you're getting about 80% of that damage on top of what you're already normally doing with it anyways. So there's a lot of extra damage you can get from the C6, obviously extremely strong. The C4 is pretty good. I do think that C0 Lyney works perfectly fine, but if you get the C1, I would say that you might want to take a look at the C2 just because they work so well in tandem together, but it is an extra constellation, a possible extra 180 wishes just to get 60% crit damage. If that's worth it for you, then go ahead. But if, that feels like it's a little bit too much, then don't worry about it as well. Once again, I think C0 Lyney still works perfectly fine as well. Looking at Lyney as a character though, I think with teams, it's pretty easy. I've talked about this kind of already before a little bit earlier in the video. It's pretty good. It's going to be very quick. You want 3 pyro characters with Lyney almost every single time. The fourth character is going to kind of depend on what your team setup looks like. Obviously, you can do what they're doing here, having 3 pyro characters just random with an electro character. You can use someone like Farina here, a hydro character like Kokomi. Don't worry about characters like Xingqiu or a character like Yelan because they will not be able to trigger their hydro application with him, so that is something to keep in mind. But someone like Farina obviously is going to be one of his better teammates for a vaporized team, and even in general with his HP change, because she'll be giving him a buff, he'll be changing his HP a bunch, and although she's deleting some of his HP, you're also helping the 4-piece of his Mare Chassé set that you're usually running with him as a character, so that's also helping. So those 2 characters, obviously, Farina's the best support that you can give to any character in the game probably, but she's also one of the best characters to give to, obviously, the characters that are in Fontaine. She works extremely well with them even more. So overall, Farina's probably a good slot to have in the 4th slot. A character like Zhongli for protection, as well as some resistance shred, could also be good. A character like Kazuha, Venti, Jean, Sucrose, characters that can use that 4-piece Viridescent. Their buffs that they can give can also be helpful as well. Kazuha giving elemental damage bonus, healing from Jean. Venti's a little bit more on the damage side, as well as holding enemies in place for you. Technically could be helpful, especially if they're all grouped together. They can all take the damage from Lyney at one time. So that can also be pretty helpful, and they're not moving around because they're kind of stuck in the void that Venti just created. So that's also pretty good from those characters. Characters more recent that you can use as well. Characters that have a 4-piece of the Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City. Characters like Shilonen, the resistance, the elemental damage bonus that she can give. Extremely solid character, as well as healing as well. She will be able to trigger that because they're part of the other 3 characters are part of the core 4. Very, very good. There's really a lot of other characters you can use. Kachina for the same reason, except with the resistance shred, she'll just give the elemental damage bonus. You could use other characters, cryo characters, shielders like Layla. You could use characters that are a little bit more focused on healing, obviously like hydro characters like Kokomi or something like that. There's plenty of other characters that you can use with Lyney. Kind of the 4th slot just opens itself up. Electro characters, especially if you're running a Chevreuse team. So once again, as I talked about earlier, Lyney, Chevreuse, Bennett probably, or Mawika or something like that, as well as running like Yae Miko, Fischl, someone with good off-field electro application, even Auron. Now Auron, you probably wouldn't want to run in this team just because he does good application and whatnot that can help the team, but his personal damage is going to kind of fall off just because there's no electro charge happening in the team usually here because of the overload kind of a lot of consistency. I would say one of Lyney's better teams is probably going to be Overload with Chevreuse, Fischl or Yae Miko or something like that, and maybe Bennett and Mawika. One of those many combos that I just talked about there. Once again, Farina with Lyney and 2 other pyro characters, maybe like Mawika and Bennett, also going to be extremely helpful. If that kind of can work for you, that's good. Using Kazuha, like I said before, in this 4th slot as well. There's just so many slots that you can use. And for you free-to-play players or the players that don't have a lot of characters and you're just newer to the game, a lot of the 4 stars can work as well. Xiangling you can get from the Spiral Abyss by doing some of the lower levels. And Bennett usually comes around a lot in the runs in the banners, but also he's in the shop for you to get and use some of your materials to use. So you can get Bennett pretty easily. And then using a character like Fischl for you guys is probably going to be a very good idea as well. Or maybe someone that's a little bit different like Barbara for just straight up heals. It's kind of just depending on what you want to use in that last slot. Maybe Sucrose, because if you're running her on a 4-piece Viridescent, she also can work pretty well with this team as well, giving Lyney and other of those characters more damage. So I think overall there are plenty of good characters to use. There are plenty of good teams that Lyney can use. And even though we always see him as just a only pyro character, there's actually a few different teams that he can use. They all just kind of revolve around 3 pyro characters. Now I know that there are people that are going to say, and I want to bring it up just because I know I'm going to get, comments about it. Yes, you can run some random, Lyney, some hydro characters for off-field application for hydro, and going to some vaporized kind of idea with him, or maybe melt depending on the characters you have. Maybe with a new character like Sitlali. Sitlali could also be an extremely good character, by the way, as the 4th character. But if you want to run some sort of full melt team without 3 pyro characters, yes, I know people do it, and technically it can work here and there, but the best and easiest way to run Lyney is going to be with 3 pyro characters. I think Mawika in the future is going to be a solid character. Bennett's probably going to be staying here, if not using Chevrus with an electro character for overload. So there's just so much that really can be talked about Lyney with teams, just because it's kind of just never ending because of the amount of pyro characters that we have and the extra slots of characters that are just solid shielders, solid buffers that can be kind of put in that 4th slot. Well, that's everything I've got talking about Lyney. If you guys did enjoy the video, please go ahead and subscribe. If you guys had any other ideas about how to use Lyney, maybe other ways that you use him, play him, kind of put him in different teams, let me know down in the comments. Thank you guys for watching the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.